Good morning, everyone. I hope you can see on your screen the home slide for the Regional Freight Mobility Plan that's being developed for the Central Midlands Council of Governments. Welcome to our webinar to discuss where we are and where we're headed with the Regional Freight Mobility Plan for the Central Midlands region of South Carolina. This is Jenny Humphreys, a Senior Transportation Planner with CDM Smith, and you'll hear from our planning team that includes Tim Smith, Ariel Promislow, both of CDM Smith, and Julie Hussey, who is managing our public engagement efforts. Her firm, Civic Communications, has been supporting our project from its inception and will continue as we complete this plan development. We've got close to a full hour of content to share with you this morning, and we certainly welcome feedback and questions at designated question and answer times. But during the recording of this webinar, and it will be recorded for future use and viewings, but during the presented material, we will have all participants on mute as to prevent any background noise and distractions that could be taking place in your area. As mentioned, we did schedule just about an hour for the webinar, but the planning team is available to stay online to answer questions and provide additional feedback if desired by the audience. So here we are talking about the Regional Freight Mobility Plan for the Central Midlands region. As a reminder, the purpose and objective of this Freight Mobility Plan for the Columbia Central Midlands region is not to recreate any planning work that's been done by others, but to supplement planning efforts and transportation improvement projects with an additional focus on freight mobility. Number one, we will be identifying transportation infrastructure and policy improvements necessary to support or enhance or even expand freight mobility needs in the region. And number two, which is a big part of why we're having this webinar with you today, is to establish and foster multi-jurisdictional planning relationships. You'll hear a little later about the significance of these relationships and your participation, not just in the finalization of this regional freight mobility plan, but also in the identification of projects and the implementation of those improvements and needs in the region. On the screen before you is a summary of our project tasks, our scope of work, if you will. We started this process just about a year ago, and we're on track to complete these tasks. A great deal of what you'll be hearing this morning is an overview of our findings on tasks 1, 2, 3, and 5. And under development now are tasks 4 and 6, which are the final deliverables of the freight plan. So what we encourage you to do as listeners today is hear what's been happening, hear the data, see the trends and needs of the region, and make sure over the next couple months as you review draft documents and participate in outreach efforts to please provide your feedback and then carry this plan forward into implementation. A note on our final deliverables: the Columbia Regional Freight Mobility Plan will cover these main topics. And in the past, I know as a transportation planner and all of you in your public and private sector roles, we often find planning documents that consume a tremendous amount of paper and just sort of get filed away in the library of plans. But what we are doing with this one is really refining it into an abbreviated, user-friendly document that you all can share with your constituents, your policymakers, and so on, and then provide a series of technical memoranda that have already been produced as a series of appendices and references. We're not going to torture anyone with 100-plus page documents of economic analysis or traffic forecasts and so on. What we want to do is make this an easy product to use. In addition to that standalone freight mobility plan, this will also serve as the freight section of the COATS, the Columbia Area MPO, the freight section of their long-range transportation plan. Before you is our project schedule. I'm happy to report that this schedule has not changed since we started this process in October of 2016. We had approximately a 12-month schedule, and all working tasks are on schedule, with the vast majority of the technical analysis and documentation coming to completion this month, October 2017. Now, our schedule will continue into the latter months of 2017 as we go through the review, finalization, and adoption process. And as you'll hear a bit later in this webinar, you will also hear about the ongoing public engagement activities that will continue through 2017 and hopefully into the next few years as our plan recommendations move into the implementation process. I'm going to hand it over to Tim Smith, who's leading this technical analysis, and Tim is going to share with you more information about the Midlands Freight story. Tim?
All right, thank you, Jenny. We're going to start by reviewing and providing you all with a high-level overview of the efforts and planning analysis that's been conducted to date. I'd like to point out first that this is a high-level overview, so please, if you want the details and some of the additional data behind what we're presenting today, please visit our project website that Julie Hussey will present later in this presentation. So for a high-level overview, starting with task one, task one was the existing conditions analysis. So what that is taking a look at the system capacity, system operations, how your existing system operates and works, and what the strengths and weaknesses are of that. We included safety and security, looking at connectivity between rural and urban areas, and also between the various modes, and then also the economic impacts. Again, the existing conditions is a high-level overview of the region's freight network. We looked at related freight planning efforts, the inland ports and intermodal container transfer facilities in the region, as well as the roadways, railways, and aviation facilities. Some of the related planning efforts we reviewed for this effort included the SCDOT State Freight Plan, the SCDOT Statewide Rail Plan, the Columbia Rail Corridor Plan, the Central Midland COG's 2040 LRTP Long Range Transportation Plan, as well as various local government comprehensive plans. This next slide provides an overview of the inland ports and intermodal container transfer facilities throughout the state. That's important for the region. If you'll notice, there is the Dillon Inland Port up in the PD region, the Greer Inland Port upstate, as well as the ITCF at Charleston down in the Low Country. So if you look, it's easy to point out here that the Midlands region is right in the middle of the state and has easy access to all of these intermodal facilities with good rail and road network connecting them. So the next slide provides the strategic freight network as designated by SCDOT. You'll notice that these are the red roadways on the map. You'll notice that it includes most of the interstates, I-26, 77, I-20, I-126, as well as US 378 and US 1. And this slide, in a similar fashion, provides an overview of the rail network that connects the Midlands region to the rest of the state. You'll notice there are rail lines from CSX, Norfolk Southern, as well as a variety of transfer facilities and rail yards within the region. Existing constraints. Next we looked at, once we identified the existing network, we wanted to go in and look at and identify some of the constraints that the networks were facing that would be hindrances to continued growth for freight in the region. For highways, that's typically going to be bottlenecks or congestion. For railways, we typically look at grade crossings or often conflicts between rail lines and surface streets. The Columbia, there has been identified some at-grade crossing conflicts at Assembly Street in downtown Columbia. That's been in some of the plans we looked at. And for aviation, we reviewed the airport master plan, which identified a need for cargo apron expansion, an additional cargo building, as well as a direct connection from the airport to the surface roadway network. Columbia International Airport is an important regional hub for UPS. The bottlenecks on the roadway network. This slide presents the bottlenecks identified using The Federal Highway Administration's National Performance Measure Research Data Set that SCDOT was shared with us. Thank you, SCDOT, for that. This data set uses vehicle speed probe data to analyze the operations in the roadway network. It does allow us to pull out specifically heavy truck traffic, and so you'll see that there are some bottlenecks of the heavy trucks experience on I-26 and I-20 specifically, and then some additional ones on the arterial roads in the urbanized area of the city of Columbia. We identified several low clearance bridges, a total of 5 in the region. These are bridges with a height clearance of less than 15 feet. All 5 of them are located on I-26, so that's important for your high, heavy truck traffic. Next, we'll talk briefly about the economic impacts of freight in the Midlands region. We conducted an economic analysis to identify the impact of freight and how it impacts the region through its truck, rail, and aviation traffic. This slide provides some high-level summary statistics of the gross impact through the millions of tons of freight moved by the 3 primary modes, as well as the value of freight moved by those 3 modes. So you'll notice that truck, as far as tons, is the highest at 65.1 million tons moved in 2011, with rail moving 30.3 million tons in 2011 and air 0.02. Then correspondingly, the value, the truck freight has a much higher value as well at $111 billion, rail at $20 billion, and air at $5.2 billion. It is important to look into the details of some of this data. For example, the rail, although aviation is on the gross numbers is a much smaller number, the per value per ton and value number is much higher for aviation. If you're familiar with freight movements, you may understand that a lot of your heavier, low value freight typically is moved by rail, especially if the time is not a factor, whereas aviation is typically used for high value, time sensitive cargo. So when you look at aviation, the value per ton of freight moved for aviation is $270,000 of value per ton of freight moved by aviation, whereas for truck it's $1,700 and rail $960. With respect to the truck tonnage, as it is the biggest component of freight movement through the region, this next slide provides some more direction and detail on the movements of that truck freight. 9.3% of truck freight in the region originates in the Midlands region and travels to locations in South Carolina outside the Midlands region. 11.3% of truck tonnage originates in the Midlands region and has destinations outside the state of South Carolina. 6.6% of truck freight originates within the state, traveling to the Midlands region. 9.4% of truck freight originates outside the state with destinations within the Midlands region. And 3.8% of truck freight has origins and destinations. So these truck movements, freight movements are contained completely within the Midlands region at 3.8%. 10.1% of truck freight originates outside the Midlands region, travels through the Midlands region to destinations outside the Midlands region. And then 10.8% originates outside the state of South Carolina, travels through the Midlands region to other destinations within the state. 14.7% of truck freight originates within the state, travels through the Midlands region to areas outside the state. And the greatest single component category at 24% are truck freight movements that originate and have final destinations outside the state of South Carolina but travel through the state and through the Midlands region. So in summary, the Midlands region is a bridge that acts as a bridge to other areas within the state and areas outside the state. 65% of truck tonnage moves through the region. And for rail traffic, that number is even higher at 77% of rail traffic moving through the region. This next slide breaks down those same movements by the 3 modes in addition to truck. So again, you'll see that the through movements for truck is the highest, for rail the highest as well. This slide breaks down the various commodities moved by the different modes, the most popular commodities. You notice that for trucks, the secondary traffic is the highest category at 13.6%. And when we talk about secondary traffic, that is those regional truck drayage movements, which are shorter trips typically used for repositioning and distributing raw materials and finished products from warehouses to the final delivery retail locations and whatnot. And then for rail, the largest category is coal at 10%, which again, if you're moving something that's heavy, low value, and is not time sensitive, rails is the ideal mode for that. So that's why you. In summary, the freight story, and summarizing the freight story, so the freight infrastructure in the Columbia region is well developed. It has a mature network of roadways, railways, and aviation facilities. There are some bottlenecks and areas where improvements could be made. As far as total freight movements, in 2011 there were 95.5 million tons of freight moved, worth $146 billion, 2/3 of which moved by truck. Again, air value per ton has a much higher value than the other modes at $270,000 per ton of air cargo moved by freight. And the Columbia region, the Midlands region, acts as a bridge. 65% of tonnage through truck and rail moves through the region to major nodes such as Charleston, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia. And some of those major commodities moving through the region are chemicals, the secondary trips, non-metallic minerals, coal, and shipping containers. The next task of the study was to look at the land use, the facilities, infrastructure, and the regulatory, such as the comprehensive plan policies, and conduct a future demand analysis. We did this by looking at land use information through the comprehensive plans, identifying industrial parks, and we also conducted a truck parking facility capacity analysis. And Era Promislo is going to present to us that land use analysis that was conducted.
So going over the regional land use policies, we looked at the local land use policies of each municipality within the Central Midlands region. So we looked at comprehensive plans and zoning ordinances, and we summarized the results in our technical memorandum. But essentially, we looked at the existing land use, future land use, zoning of the available comprehensive plans and zoning ordinances. And from these municipal policies, we summarized their policies of freight land uses in the technical memorandum, just to get an idea of the freight situation currently existing within the region. So moving on to the freight land use analysis, the purpose of this was to identify the areas and facilities that would be critical to ensuring efficient freight flows. So a large part of this was looking at several different types of freight areas. So existing industrial parks, future industrial parks, priority investment areas, which we identified from the local comprehensive plans, and regional growth scenarios, which we identified from the COG's long-range transportation plans. So we looked at these areas and then compared them to the existing freight network in order to identify the gaps that we might see. So to go over the existing industrial parks, essentially there are quite a few already existing in the Central Midlands region. And the key takeaway you might notice from this chart is that there are quite a few existing industrial parks in Lexington and Richland counties, but there's still some growth anticipated for the region as a whole as well. But we've got quite a few large tenants that do have business in this region, such as Amazon, LuLaRoe, Belk, among others within this region. So you'll see on the next slide that the existing industrial parks are fairly heavily located along I-26 and I-77, with a lot of activity near the I-26 and I-77 corridors. And you see a few other industrial parks in Newberry and Fairfield County as well, with some in the Coates regions of Calhoun and Kershaw counties as well. So we look at the future industrial parks, and you can see there's quite a lot of growth anticipated for these areas. So there's quite a lot, again, within the I-26 and I-77 corridor, and quite a few in the I-77 region of Richland County and Fairfield. But now we see a lot more anticipated growth in Newberry County as well. So there's quite a few undeveloped industrial parks that are anticipated to grow in the future. So now looking at the priority investment areas, again, we did take these from the local comprehensive plans, and the priority investment areas specifically relate to freight activities where it was anticipated that these specific areas will be freight centers, so to speak. You see a lot around the Columbia area along I-20, I-77, and I-26 as well. And moving forward to the regional growth areas, these were taken from the Coates Long-Range Transportation Plan, and these are not specifically freight related. These are areas identified as those anticipated to have a lot of population growth. So we're talking about Northeast Richland County, Blythewood, Irmo, Dutch Fork, Chapin, the town of Lexington, downtown Columbia, and Southeast Columbia. And this is important to identify because if there's a higher population coming in, there's going to be an influx of goods and services needed to service this increased population. So that was another important future growth area to identify. So we took the future growth areas and overlaid them with the freight corridors just to see what areas are expected to be heavily populated and heavily anticipated to have a lot of freight activity in the future. Again, you can see the I-26, I-77 junction, and I-77 north of the Columbia area having a lot of freight activity anticipated in the future. But there's still growth in the other areas surrounding the Central Midlands region. So to move on to how these future growth areas will affect the existing freight infrastructure, we overlaid this with the freight bottlenecks and the future growth areas. And you see a lot of bottlenecks in the downtown Columbia area and in how they interact with the future growth areas. So we see some intersections with the I-20 area and the Northeast Richland County regional growth areas, and some of the industrial parks that we're expecting to develop in the future. So it's kind of important to identify that where we're currently experiencing existing bottlenecks and how they will impact the future growth areas in the future. So I'll pass it back to Tim to talk about truck parking.
Okay, thank you, Earl. One of the other, in addition to looking at the land use and where future growth was anticipated to occur, we looked at truck parking to see how the truck parking facilities were operating there and if there was a shortage of truck parking in the region. So we conducted an analysis to identify the extent there's a shortage in the Midlands region of truck parking facilities available to the truckers. And we started by creating an inventory of the facilities in the study area. When we did that, we realized there were really 2 or 3 types of facilities. One type is those that had fully designated spaces. All the spaces were designated such that they were striped or marked, and there were a specific number of spaces available. There were some facilities that had a mixture of both, of designated spaces and just open lots where there were no designated spaces but places that trucks could park. And there were some that had no designated at all. They were just open lots or gravel lots available for parking. So we conducted a field survey on May 18th and 16th and 18th between 9:50 p.m. and 3 a.m. We had survey crew out and count the trucks parked in the spaces during that time. And so by doing so, we were able to develop utilization rates based on dividing the number of trucks parked at the facility by the number of available total parking spaces. So the next map shows the location of the identified parking facilities by type. You'll notice that the rose-colored dots are those facilities that had all designated spaces. The orange dots are those that had a mixture of designated spaces and non-designated spaces. And then finally, the red dots are those that had no designated spots whatsoever. And the result of the analysis, the utilization analysis, is on the current slide, which shows if you see all of the facilities that had designated spaces, they were all found to be at 71% utilized or greater, with the red ones being at 90 to 100% utilized. So there definitely was the facilities are definitely well utilized, and there seems to be a need for additional facilities in the region. This next slide gives an example of one of the parking facilities that has designated spaces. This is the Flying J on I-20 at exit 70. You'll notice the trucks, you can see that there are striped parking spaces and the trucks are neatly lined up in those. And then the next slide is an example of one that does not have designated spaces. This is an open lot where trucks can park as they see fit. The third task for this study was to review best practices in freight mobility. We did that by looking at peer-reviewed studies, so other freight plans in like areas. Looked at research from other planning efforts, and then also public and private industry solutions that are out there. Best practices are organized into three categories: freight technology trends and applications, safety and security of freight movement, and then public and private partnerships. So this slide gives an example of a couple of peer-reviewed studies that we looked at to come up with best practices. We looked at a number of between 7 and 10 studies, and then we're able to identify and narrow it down to 2 that were most similar to the Midlands region based on their population demographics and economic industries. The 2 that we found were the Savannah Coastal Region MPO Freight Study, the Nashville Regional Freight and Goods Movement Study. And so a couple of examples from what best practices that we found out of these studies were, for example, the Savannah one had the best practice to maximize growth and infill in areas adjacent to the freight network. And then the Nashville study recommended that the MPOs or Council of Governments could assist local governments in coordinating freight and land use planning in their local plans. All right, so task 4, as Jenny mentioned earlier, task 4, we just started working on this, and that's to come up with a list of prioritized regional needs. You can measure priorities with a variety of measures, such as improving bridge clearance. Do the projects or the improvements improve safety, such as rail safety? Do they expand air cargo operations? Do they improve incident management times? These are all things that we're looking at as developing performance measures for this plan. The prioritized list of regional needs, we're using a variety of sources to come up with the needs in the projects. We've reviewed the SCDOT State Freight Plan, reviewed its projects and policies. We're coming up with the needs identified from the gap and land use analysis that Ariel mentioned. And then we're also looking at the MPO, the COATS MPO's existing LRTP to identify projects in there that are freight supportive. And we'll develop those prioritization filters and apply those to the projects to come up with a finalized recommended list of ranked projects. Task 5 is development of freight performance measures. And performance measures are used to help measure the progress that your projects and your plan is making towards meeting the goals and objectives that are outlined within it. So it's important that they're simple, that they're aligned with the goals, and that they help maintain eligibility for federal support, such as through the FAST Act of MAP 21. The freight performance measures are used to gauge how the system is operating. They help in plan development by evaluating the current performance and impacts of the plan. They help in plan implementation to highlight the goals and objectives and incorporate those into agency budgets, program structure, and project selection. And they're also used for accountability to make sure that you can report on system performance and that you're making progress towards the goals that you've outlined. This next slide provides a brief overview. In order to be consistent with the federal guidance and state guidance, we're relying heavily on the SCDOT state freight plan. So this shows the performance measures and goals from that plan, the state freight plan as well as the state rail plan, that this plan is being developed to be consistent with. Now, those are goals such as mobility and system reliability, increasing safety, improving infrastructure condition, encouraging economic and community vitality, and improving environmental quality and equity in the transportation system. So this plan is being developed to be consistent with these goals and performance measures.
Last but not least, we want to talk a little bit about the public engagement that we've done throughout this process. What we have done is really in the same way that we've kind of approached a lot of the other efforts of seeing what is out there and building on top of what's there. We decided to have a similar focused approach to our outreach. And we have built, we went through 17 different plans, including transportation, land, and economic development plans, to see what the public was saying in those plans and through those processes and the recommendations that were made. From those 17 plans, which can be found on our website, and if we need to add some others, just let us know. From those 17 plans, we just learned that freight mobility is recognized as a vital component to the region. We learned that though sometimes when it is recognized, it's recognized in a narrower scope than it could be, and there is a need to kind of recognize all three modes of road, air, and rail. Within that same kind of mindset, there seemed to be a little bit of some untapped opportunities of moving freight by air. We saw one study that actually called out air transportation and focused on that, but it was one of the few. Other studies focused on trucks, but not so much on rail, and then some, like the state plan, focused on all three. Freight appears when it has advocates, but it's often left out when the advocates are not in the room. And for example, we saw that in some of the conversations about complete streets, which do not include freight mobility within there. We also saw it in some of the recommendations for some of the land use development that didn't talk about things like delivery plans and other things, especially if they were promoting mixed use development. And we also saw it a little bit within some of the safety conversations. The safety within the freight corridor is usually addressed in kind of a piecemeal fashion. We don't want to have trucks going through our neighborhood. There should be a truck route here. We're concerned about this rail crossing in our neighborhood. We don't like the sound of trains in our neighborhood, or this one road is dangerous, but not necessarily a comprehensive look for the whole region. So our hope is this study will reflect that. Finally, again and again, we saw the recognition of the need for coordination. And we believe that pulling together freight mobility leaders will help us create this coordination, just because by their very nature, they're very connected. So with that, freight mobility leaders, we really want to encourage you to participate in the process and go to our website, www.centralmidlandsfreightmobility.org, where you can find so many of the documents that we've talked about today, links to them. We've also have a survey there that it's really short, 2 to 5 minutes, that go through just kind of what freight mobility means to the region. And we're also starting a freight mobility council, trying to get some people together to talk about what that could look like and how it could become sustainable over time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Julie and Tim and Ariel. So at this point, what we'll do is unmute our guests to see if there are any questions from the audience. And guests are also certainly invited to type their comments in case they're having some sort of an issue with audio getting through. As we wait for those comments or questions to come in, I'll reiterate the need to circulate this survey and project website to your constituencies, your colleagues, and decision makers for the agency that you work for. I know we've had a great deal of success with getting survey responses when we share that link. Well, first of all, keeping the survey brief, and I do believe that this survey, it only takes about 2 minutes to complete at the most. And so I do believe it's very easy to complete. But we have a great deal of success whenever we circulate it to colleagues, fellow employees, and so on, because people do care about what we're doing.
Once you do it, you can easily share it on Facebook and Twitter.
There you go. It's available to push through social media. And I think this should resonate with a great many of you on the phone today at SCDOT, Richland County, City of Columbia, and others who are responsible for other plans, other transportation plans and land use plans, and implementing transportation improvement projects. Getting that feedback is critical to be sure that the final design for infrastructure projects match the needs of the users. So we're certainly looking for that input because I think we all know planners and engineers can do the best we can, but it's public opinion that certainly tips the scale when it comes to designing exactly what we need.
Speaking of that, I see that Lee has a question. Lee's question has to do with making sure that we get some information to her so they can post the survey on their website, and we will send out a notice about the survey to everybody that's on this call, reminding them of it and giving a little bit of information that they can use to help us spread the word.
Great. Thanks, Julie. And thanks for the question. So we'll push that out. I will make a note to you all about the Freight Mobility Council. When we first kicked off this project and laid out this concept of developing a Freight Mobility Council, there was a little bit of question or even concern about what are we going to ask people to do? Is it one more meeting? Is it one more commitment for folks in the community to make? And under MAP 21 guidance and FAST Act guidance, the development of a freight council has really proven to be a helpful group of people because, as Julie mentioned earlier, one of our lessons learned from previous planning efforts is that freight is important to the community, but it really isn't considered until there are advocates involved. So the idea of a Freight Mobility Council for the Central Midlands region will be a makeup of public sector representatives, private sector representatives, and even members of academia and others who can speak to their needs, concerns, their safety issues, their business issues that depend on safe and efficient freight mobility of trucks and trains and air cargo. And so that council will, in reality, as we move forward over the next months and years, is that group should find touch points to regroup and identify what's going on in the community and provide information to all of us who are trying to plan and design infrastructure projects to make sure those freight considerations are in there. So in effect, they'll end up being our freight champions and helpful to the community. So I'm not hearing any more questions or seeing any more comments pop up on the screen. So we will go ahead and wrap this up, but we certainly appreciate everybody's time this morning. And please look forward to the finalization of this plan and your participation in the implementation of our recommendations. Thanks so much and have a great weekend.
Thank you.